For this skills demonstration, we will learn about the concept of variable lists. Now, in previous sessions, we learned that variables were a useful tool to allow us to name our data, and then use that name to facilitate and abstract the manipulation of the data. In our discussion of variables, we saw that each variable holds a single value, like a number or some text, right? Sometimes, however, we want to be able to manipulate a collection of data, inventory, class rosters, my to-do list. These are all multi-valued data sets, and I would also like to be able to manipulate them by name. To do that, we need a list structure. So in this session, we're going to explore how App Inventor allows us to create lists, select items from the list, process the entire list as a group, add items to the list, and remove items from the list. Let's see how it works. Okay, to start off with, I'm going to go right into the block editor for a new project. And just like before, I'm going to go here to the variables drawer and create a new variable. Now, ordinarily, we would stick some text or some numeric data into this spot here by going to the math drawer or to the text drawer and putting a literal value in there to initialize it. Instead, however, I'm going to go to the list drawer, and I can create an empty list if I want to. This is the same as having an empty string or having a 0 in. But what I really like to do is I'm just going to make a list. And you see, a list is at least 2 values. But if I want to add more, I can always use that blue square there to create a list that contains as many items as I want. In this case, I'll create a list that has 4 items. I'm going to call this list the Beatles. And what goes in there? Well, a collection of text, right? The Beatles are John, oops. And I'll just duplicate that, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. All right? So that's the basic way that I can create a list. Now, what do I want to do with this list? Let me get back out to my designer for a second. I'm going to create a button to give us a trigger. And I'm not going to worry about the naming of it right now. I'm going to put a notifier in here, though, just so I have something that can display some data for me. All right. Let's go back to my block editor. When button 1 is clicked, I'd like to display one of these Beatles. So in my notifier, I'm going to show a message. And I'm going to fill in my standards here. Title is Beatles, and my button text is going to be OK. For my message, I want to display an individual member of the list, of the Beatles. I want to select George from the list and display it. So to do that, I'm going to look in the list drawer, and I'm going to find the block that deals with selection. Select an item from the list. Well, which list am I talking about? I'm talking about the Beatles. And the index, what is the index? The index is the number that corresponds to an entry in the list. So John is number 1, Paul is number 2, George is number 3, Ringo is number 4. Right? Because John's the first one on the list, and so on, right? Okay, so the index that I want, if I wanted to display George, I would go in here and type in 3. Okay? Let's see how this works on my screen. Okay, so I'm going to push the button, and what's going to display is George. And if I wanted to display one of the other ones, for example, if I wanted to display John, I'm just going to change that index to be John, and when I push the button now, I get John displayed. All right. So I've got this concept of a list, a group of information, and it's a numbered list. It's indexed. And so I can now process an individual entry from that list. Sometimes I want to process the entire group. I want to process each element of the list. I'd like to go through and I'd like to do something with each one of these elements of my list. And to do that requires an additional control structure. So I'm going to go up to my control drawer, and it's the third one in here. The third block in here works with items in a list. And it's saying do something for each item in the list. So this is kind of a repeating block, actually, because it's going to do this set of instructions to, well, what list am I working with? I'm working with the Beatles. It's going to do this set of instructions to John, this set of instructions to Paul, this set of instructions to George, this set of instructions to Ringo, because each one of those in turn is going to become item. Now what does I want to do? I want to, what? Just display the item. Oops. There we go. So when the button's pushed, for each item in Beatles, I want to display it. Let's have a look. Ringo, George, Paul, John. Good. It processed all of them. Now, you'll notice that it didn't necessarily go through the list in order. It started with Ringo, for example. Right? Don't worry about why that is right now, but we know that it went through each item in the list and did something to each item in the list. Okay? All right. So now what we can do is we can process an individual item, or we can process each item in the list. Okay, the next thing I wanted to do was to show you how to add items to the list. We're not going to add anyone to the Beatles. Let's create a brand new list. In fact, let's create a new project. I'm going to call this new project My Favorites. Okay? And for new favorites, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a horizontal arrangement, and I'm going to add a text box, and I'm going to add a button. So I'm going to type in some text, and when I push the button, I'd like to add it to the list. To what list? Well, I'm actually going to put a list view on here. And like I told you before, I'm going to go ahead and make this bigger so we'll be able to see it on our screen. Okay. So it was kind of awkward to cycle through and use the notifier to display our list. So instead, I'm going to create a list, and I'm going to display it using my list view. Okay. Now notice I'm not going to put anything in this list to start with. I'm going to leave this elements from string. I'm going to leave that property blank. Let's go ahead into the block editor here. And, well, let's create a new list. Faves. And favorites is going to be a new empty list to start with. But when I push the add button, what do I want to do? I want to take my list and I want to add items to it. Add items to list. And what do I need? I need to provide the list. So let's put a list in there, faves. And what item do I want to add to the list? I want to add whatever the text box, whatever value I entered into the text box. Now, does this add this? Does this add it to the list that's displayed on my screen? Does this add it to list view 1? No. What I have is I have my own private list, favorites. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to say, make favorites the list that's shown in this list view. So what I need to do is I need to set list view elements to favorites. Does that make sense? So the actual list resides out here in the favorites, in the faves variable. But then I'm using that variable to populate the list view. Let's take a look at what this looks like on screen. So if I go in here and I say red, we'll see it added to my list. And then I can change that. I also like green. I can add that to my list. Right? And there, good to go. Okay. Now, I may also want to remove from the list. Maybe if I select green, I want to strike it off the list. Or if I select red, I want to strike off the list, right? Let's see how we do that. So what do you think? When the list view is selected, after a picking, what do I want to do? I want to remove from the list. Here we go. Remove from the list. The list I know is what I want, faves. And the index. What's the index? What number did I select? Well, how do I know? If I look at list view can tell me the selection, and it can tell me the selected index. So in this case, what I'm looking for is what number was selected. Right? And does that take care of it? Not quite. What I've done is I've removed it from the faves list, but the list view is still going to show me what it was shown before. Its elements is still set to the previous values. So what I also need to do is update my list view so that it shows what global favorites looks like now, what global favorites looks like after I've removed it from the list. Let's take a look. So now, if I go in here and tap one of these guys, it deletes it from the list. I tap it again, tap this one again, deletes it from the list. And I can add as many as I want, and tapping them removes them from the list. Okay? So that pretty much covers the basics of lists. What we like to do with lists is what? Work with individual entries in the list, work with the overall list, every element in the list. We like to be able to add dynamically to the list, and we like to be able to remove from the list. We'll notice that there are a few other commands in the list drawer that are also useful. I'm not going to go over them in great detail. What can I do? I can replace. I can combine two lists. I can insert an item at a particular location. Right? What else? I can ask, is a certain thing in the list? I can search the list to see if something actually occurs in the list. That's another pretty useful function. Okay? But this demonstration was meant to cover the basics, so I'll leave you with that. I want to display an entry in the list. So what I'm going to do is when the button is clicked, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to, display a message with my notifier. And let's see, for the title, I'm going to put in the Beatles. And for my button text, I'm going to put OK. And for my message, I want to display, so that's the essential way that I can